Today I'm going to show you how I make my fancy pies for Christmas, for Halloween, basically for all the holidays. I'm going to show you my step-by-step process and how I make these. So I usually hand paint all my pies, but I'm going to show you how you can easily make a stencil pie. So you're going to take a transparency, which are used for like overhead projectors. They're kind of outdated, so a lot of times they're overpriced, but you can get them on Amazon $50 for $25, not too bad. I put it on top of a stencil picture I want to work from. This is Kevin McAllister from Home Alone, and I'm going to use a Sharpie to cover up all of those black areas because that's going to be what we are cutting out with our razor in just a little bit. So you really want to make sure that you get as much detail as you can when you are filling this out, because if you even mess up a little thing, it can ruin the entire stencil. And you have to be really careful. It's kind of like cutting out a jack-o'-lantern to make sure that all the pieces are still attached and you don't cut out too much. Then I'm going to get a cutting tool. I use scalpels, or I use this Fiskars kind of like straight edge razor that comes out. It has like a nice safety mode and you can have a lock on it, so it's good to have around kids. But scalpels are actually, I think, better in my opinion because they're smaller and easier to kind of maneuver around with these small areas. Cutting the plastic can be really difficult. So for this pie, I'm using frozen strawberries and frozen peaches, which are much cheaper frozen in Alaska than they are fresh. So I generally use frozen berries and fruit in the off season. Otherwise, I use local produce. But what I'm doing is I'm going to cook it down over the stove till most of the liquid is kind of out, but I stir it until it simmers for about 20 minutes tops, and then I put it in a colander, and I basically let a lot of the extra liquid leave the fruit. And then I use cold butter. I put it into cubes, and I start making the pie crust. I make sure that the butter is still cold, and I actually hand mix because I'm not going to overwork the gluten that way. And I just feel like I have a little bit more control over the pie crust that way. I can mix it enough, and then I put it into balls, and then I put it in the refrigerator. That way I can keep it cold. A big part of pie making is keeping your pie crust as cold as possible. You don't want it to get warm. Once the pie crust is probably cooled for about 30 minutes, I start cutting it for the bottom layer of the pie to put the filling in. I always leave enough so it can overhang on the sides. You want to leave it overhanging because if you stretch the pie crust to fit over the sides, then you're going to have a lot of shrinkage that happens in the oven. Now, if you overhang it, then it shrinks less. And then I pop it in the freezer, and that's where it's going to stay for about 15 minutes. After the filling is cool, then I put it in the very cold bottom layer. Then what I do is I take the top layer and I've made an egg wash. It's just actually egg whites, and I'm using an artist paintbrush, and I'm covering the whole top layer with an egg wash, and I'm making sure to evenly coat it. I look a little intense right now, but I'm really making sure that I'm not missing any spots because this could really mess up the entire stencil. So this is the area, the top of the pie, that is going to be the stencil. So then I take that plastic transfer piece, the transparency piece. My son is filming and it's not the best. But I'm taking that transparency piece and then I'm fitting it onto the pie crust. This is also a really tricky part. You have to really make sure that there's no bubbles, it's not sticking up anywhere, especially with a stencil this intricate, because it's actually way more intricate than a lot of stencils. And I'm going to take a tool and try to make sure that it is flattened down, cutting off the extra edges. And that's my bunny running around. I have a madhouse. So really, I'm just smoothing out any air pockets, any bubbles, anything that's sticking up. And the egg whites are going to help make the stencil stick to the pie crust and also help the cinnamon stick to the pie crust once I start filling in that stencil. And then after I make sure that it's stuck down, I'm actually going to do the egg whites again on top just to kind of make sure it's secure and then it doesn't bubble up. So I'm just doing one more quick egg wash again over it. And once I feel like it's pretty good, then I'm going to take the chance and I'm taking ground cinnamon and I'm sprinkling it all over the stencil, just getting in all the cracks and all the spaces that have been cut out of that transparency plastic. Once I've sprinkled a good layer, I'm going to take my fingers and I'm going to kind of like pat it in, kind of rub it in. That way it binds with the actual pie crust and it makes it so it doesn't just think like glitter. So you don't want it to fly everywhere when you pull off the stencil. So after I've kind of rubbed in all the bits, I'm going to very gently, carefully pull away the stencil that I made, and boom, Kevin McAllister. And I'm going to throw Kevin in the freezer for like 5 minutes. So now I'm going to put on the top of the pie that I have rolled out that's cold enough. I'm going to pop this on top of this one and secure it around. I used my fingers and kind of smushed it together. So then I'm going to take this mango guava passion fruit jam. I'm going to spread it all over the top layer. Kind of acts an adhesive between the 2 layers of pie crust. And it actually adds a lot of really nice tangy flavor to it. But after we add that, we are going to add some sprinkles. I really love the Wilton products that are for cakes and baking. And so these are the Wilton Gold sprinkles that I've used on the top. Super love them, use them pretty often. Now I'm going to start focusing on the border. I'm using these cake fondant molds and I put the pie crust in there and I can get some really neat molds and I'm going to put this around the cake for a really nice kind of ornate pie crust just border. I really like the way it looks. So for anything decorative, I usually cut out with cookie cutters or I cut out by hand, and then I shape them with fondant tools. And here I'm making holly leaves, and I cut out peppermint sticks with a knife just because I didn't have a small enough cutter, and I think those look better. Then I'm going to use food coloring. I'm going to be using this food grade kind of metallic green and also a Christmas red color. They're both from the Wilton Company. I really love them. They're food gel. And what I do is I use almond extract and I mix them like on a palette or a white plate so I can kind of see that those globs right there are actually the gel that we're having a hard time breaking up. But I use almond extract because you need that alcohol in it to kind of make it loosened up, to make it more like a watercolor type paint. And then it also leaves a nice flavor behind and the alcohol burns off. But it's really neat that you can actually kind of like watercolor on pie crust, and really it leaves so many options open for you. You don't have to paint pop art like I do. It could be really anything. So I've added the green holly leaves and also those red and white candy canes, and it's ready to cook at 375 degrees. Now, because I've already cooked the inside fruit, it didn't have to go in the oven too long. It cooks for probably about 30 minutes or so, and once it starts browning a little bit around the edges, I usually pull it out then. And I also cook in a glass pan so I can make sure that I don't have, it undercooked or anything's running. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this. I'm excited to see what you make.